Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this next year development discourse session. Next year is a multi-competency advisory firm, and we're focused on solving complex development questions, and development discourse is our platform, our public discussion platform that we use in seeking answers to these complex questions. And one of the big complex questions we need to answer in Nigeria today is how do we end Nigeria's fuel subsidy regime? And today we're going to focus on the why and the how. Now, Nigeria introduced fuel subsidies back in 1973, so 50 years ago. And the intent at the point was that it would last for about 6 months to tide over on the big spike in fuel prices at the time. Well, about 5 years later, it was institutionalized. And then 50 years later, we're still stuck in it. All the regimes, civilian and military, since then, have realized that the Nigeria subsidy regime is not sustainable. They've made several efforts, limited success, in reforming the subsidy regime. It hasn't quite worked. In 2015, the Buhari administration, looked at how to reform the subsidy regime. It did not quite make a move towards it until much later. The incoming administration, has to face these same questions. And if history is a predictor of future, one can almost make a bet on how that would go. And that's the reason why we're having this conversation, to see if we can put some ideas on the table for the incoming administration on why it needs to do it and how it can do it. Now, joining me on the call today is Dr. Neil McCulloch. He's an economist and director at the Policy Practice. It's a UK-based consultancy focused on political economy analysis. His primary focus is on the political economy of fossil fuel subsidy reforms. He's worked on subsidy reforms in many countries, including Indonesia, India, Kazakhstan, Lebanon, Nigeria, and Zambia. He was previously the lead economist for the Australian aid agency in Indonesia, a senior economist at the World Bank, and a fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. He's authored a book titled Ending Fossil Fuel Subsidies, The Politics of Saving the Planet. He made the book available for free, and we shared the link to the book. So, you can download it. Neil, you're welcome.
Thank you so much.
And
with you again, Patrick.
Thank you. And joining us on the call as well is Ademola Henry Adigu. He's one of the most knowledgeable and probably the most engaged on Nigeria's petroleum policy issues in the last decade. Until recently, he was a team lead for the FOSTA Facility for Oil Sector Transformation, FOSTA program. It's a UK government-funded program that supported all the major initiatives in the sector in the last probably dozen years. His work on the petroleum industry bill is groundbreaking and inspiring. Similarly, his program supported NNPC and several other sector actors to seek ways to reform Nigeria's fuel subsidy regime. Henry, you're welcome. So I think we'll spend the first part of the discussion just in a chat to figure out the why and the how, and then later on we'll open it up for audience participation. So if I go to you, Neil, what's the cost of Nigeria's fuel subsidy regime, and why should we even be having this conversation? Why is it a big, complex issue for us to deal with?
Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick, and great to see you also, Henry. Good to be back with old friends. So the cost of Nigeria's fuel subsidy regime is truly horrendous. So in 2022, it cost around about 4.3 trillion. So that's about almost $10 billion, just subsidizing gasoline. That's it. No other benefit, just subsidizing gasoline. By mid-2023, we were told that the spend will be already about 3.4 trillion or so. So if the regime continues all the way through until the end of the year, that will be an even larger spend, perhaps up to $15 billion, something like this. So it's a huge cost. I mean, anything between a fifth and a third of the entire federal budget is being spent just making gasoline cheaper, not perhaps the most productive use. And I guess that's why it matters. We should care because Nigeria has limited resources to be able to invest in infrastructure and health and education and all of these other good things. And when it's spending such a large share of the budget just on making gasoline cheap, this is a pretty egregious misallocation of resources. And so trying to figure out a sensible way of moving from the current situation to a better one is worth thinking about.
And I mean, so we've almost every year and under every regime, we have these conversations about the cost of, fuel subsidies and so on. And the argument has always been, it is one of those things that the average Nigerian needs to get by. So there is that argument, right? That as you subsidize fuel prices, it kind of trickles through to cost of food and all of that. Is that a valid argument for retaining the fuel subsidy?
I think that it is entirely reasonable for people to be concerned about what will happen when the subsidy is removed, because prices would go up and people are already struggling. So the last thing they want is for their cost of fuel to go up. But the argument that the fuel subsidy helps the poor is completely wrong. The vast bulk of the benefit of the fuel subsidy goes to the top 20% of the population. One calculation was that if the fuel subsidy is a mechanism to help the poor, then you need to spend 25 naira to get 1 naira to the poor. So this is just about the most inefficient way of helping the poor you can imagine. They're much more effective would be to take, if you want to help the poor, then take the 10 billion that is being spent on fuel subsidy and give it to the poor. I'm sure they would be very happy. They would get far more of the money than they get from subsidizing gasoline.
How do I make this argument, for my friends who are completely against a reform of the fuel subsidy? How do I prove to them that it is not the poor who enjoy this? Because the argument is the poor take public transport, around, and it's on gasoline. The food we eat in Nigeria mostly comes from the north, and you have to transport it by road. So if you were to remove the fuel subsidy, there will be a spike in how much, percentage of household spending that goes to transportation, that goes to food. It'll be unbearable for the poor. How do I explain to them that it's really not the poor who benefit from the fuel subsidy regime?
I think one of the cruelties of fossil fuel subsidies is that whilst it is true that the better off are typically benefiting far, far more than the poor do, when you remove fuel subsidies, the poor do get hit. And they get hit for precisely the reasons that you say, mostly not because of the direct cost of gasoline, because most of them haven't got cars or motorbikes. So they're not directly filling up at the pump if you're a poor Nigerian, you don't own such things. But you are getting on a bus and the bus fares rise. And most importantly, you're trying to buy food for your family. And if you're trying to buy food for your family and all the transportation costs of food go up, then your food prices go up. And this has a big negative impact on you. So I think one of the most important things, if the government chooses to do a subsidy reform, will be to find mechanisms of protecting the poor, indeed overcompensating the poor for the harm that a reform will do. It's sad truth that even though the rich benefit the most, the poor do get hit when you do a reform. And so I totally understand why people are anxious about a reform, because it won't be fun.
And maybe let me switch to Henry. And there's this, again, still talking about the poor and fuel subsidy. There's the argument that what is subsidized today, is gasoline and not even the product that the poor actually use, which is kerosene. Could that be a compelling argument that is put to Nigerians, to show that, hey, the poor are not really benefiting from this? Can we have a conversation on how to address the subsidy issues? Henry.
Thank you, Patrick. I don't think it's possible to have a conversation like that in Nigeria. The problem about the subsidy issues, it's not economic, it's not logical, it's political. over the years in Nigeria has moved that debate away from rational arguments or arguments about poverty or who's benefiting to a political issue. Successive governments have made it a political discourse as part of other campaign strategy or used for opposition with the current government. So it is lost all rationality or logic. There's an entitlement mentality as well in the conversation. Nigerians believe that's the only thing they get from government. And there's no logical way you can tell somebody, well, you know, the rich get more. As Neil said, sadly, an increase in fuel prices, gasoline itself, will affect everybody down the ladder. So whether you're middle class, whether you're poor or whatever, you get impacted. So those arguments don't work in Nigeria. Everything that's national has left that debate. So that debate is not based on economics, it's not based on logic, it's not based on rationality. No.
So how do we drive this argument? Because as Neil just shared with us, you know, about $10 billion down the drain, a new government coming in, oil prices, we've even sold all of our crude forward, oil prices, revenues from oil, not realizable or not about to help us, you know, tide through. The incoming government needs to deal with these issues. What type of argument can they present to Nigerians that could potentially work?
I don't know. That's the honest truth. I'll be very honest. I've lost so many bets. Neil and I, of course, you know, were together when he was my director. And a lot of times I lose bets on it to be done this time around. If the Buhari government, with the challenges it's gone through in the last 8 years, with the paucity of funds, with the level of borrowing it's going through, couldn't make a decision on it, what argument could the Tinubu government make? There are many factors that are beyond arguments. I think at this point in time, where we are, is you either do it or don't do it. And Nigerians, Tinubu can't tell them, I mean, they'll tell you we survived this long without it. So what are you going to tell them anymore? If for the last many years, nothing has happened, the economy hasn't died, why is it now that it's going to die? So I honestly have no clue on what you can tell Nigerians. Nigerians don't even believe there's subsidy. People argue with you this is fraud. That subsidy thing is a fraud. You can have yeah.
So that's even a good point. How do we convince Nigerians that there is subsidy? Because even the Buhari administration prevaricated on this for a very long time. You know, what is your argument? How do you convince your grandmother that there is actually subsidy?
If it were me, you start from the comparable products and the other derivatives of petrol. So you've been in Nigeria for the past 5 years. You've seen the price of diesel creep up. Diesel was 120, 140. Last one I bought about some days ago was 800 naira per liter. You've seen the aviation fuel go up and down. We pay tickets 120, we pay 6,000 for tickets based on the aviation fuel. You've seen kerosene, and all of them come from the same source, crude. And that is an argument that is logical. I mean, if other things, I mean, if yam chips have gone up and yam flour has gone up, how can you now say yam itself is still cheap? Because they're all derivatives of the same yam thing.
Well, I think the point he was trying to make is that, you know, whatever any government does, the Nigerians would not believe them. Henry, I think we lost you for a minute.
Yeah, I said a government that lives like a Qatar or UAE that buys Jeeps, that buys Mercedes, whatever, Maybach and crap and all that like that, that every new incoming government will take all the cars away and buy new cars, can't tell Nigerians that they should feel the pain. They don't live as if there's a pain. The government live as if we are a Middle East country. So Nigerians have that mentality, well, if we're a Middle East country, fuel prices should be Middle East prices. And you can't tell them any logic about it. So the government itself must show an attitude of conservation.
So Neil, let me come to you. And I mean, these questions are not peculiar to Nigeria, right? It's the same questions that different countries around the world are asking. You know, many of these countries around the world have some form of fuel subsidy or the other, right? And that's another argument that's been put forward by Nigerians to say, if most countries in the world have fuel subsidies, why are we hell-bent on this stuff, which is really the only thing the poor get from Nigeria? You know, we've tried to answer that question. I'm not sure if we've convinced anyone that it's not really the poor, you know, who benefit from this. But how do we make that argument that we must get out of this fuel subsidy regime?
I wanted to come back on something Henry said, which I think is very important. We did a survey in Nigeria in 2018 to ask people what they felt about fuel subsidies. And first of all, we asked them whether they exist, and they said no. And then we said, do you want them to be removed? And they said no. And then we provided lots of information and argument about why it was a good idea for us to remove the fuel subsidies. And then we said, so what do you think now? Do you think they should be removed? And people said no. So I don't think people are being stupid or irrational. I think people perfectly well understand. But at the same time, I think they're recognizing that removing the fuel subsidies will be painful. And that's why I loved Henry's answer. You know, I don't know what's going to work. I don't know what's going to work, but I do know one thing. It's political. It's not a technical or an economic argument. So I think we should stop trying to persuade people. You know, hey, this is going to be good for you. Let's try and persuade you. This is going to be good for you. Here's a bunch of statistics that show you it's going to be good for you. It's not going to work. People aren't persuaded by that. They don't have trust in the government and that it's going to deliver on things. What you do need is a positive political offer. And this is where I think you could do something useful, where politicians, and you pointed on comment on other countries. You mentioned my book, which I've just published, and I put the link in the chat if anybody wants to download it. It's available for free. But the key message that comes out from the subsidy reforms in lots of other countries is that you have to make it a positive political thing instead of a negative political thing. If you go out to the population and you say, hey, this thing is bad for a whole bunch of complicated reasons, which we can't really explain to you, but don't worry, we're going to compensate you a little bit. People will not vote for that. But if you say, I'm going to give you free healthcare, I'm going to give you a decent education, I'm going to give you the road that we haven't built for the last period of time, then suddenly people have something positive to come out of it. That's what Indonesia did. That's what India did. That's what a lot of countries have done who have been more successful in the subsidy reform process. So I think we need to have a positive political dynamic rather than just a negative one.
So we'll come to that. But Henry, how do you respond to Neil's position, right? Given that we have gone down this road before, right? If you remember in 2012, when the Jonathan administration tried to repeal or remove the subsidies, got the pushback from Nigerians, and then we went to the subsidy removal and reinvestment fund program, SURE-P. Didn't we try all of this? The level of success is debatable. Why would Nigerians want to go through that process again? When we realized that even after going through that, we still came back, the subsidies came back, and even came back on steroids.
I mean, spot on. Neil and I and your office worked together with Kachiku in 2016, and price moved from 95 naira to 45 naira. And at that point in time, government said we remove subsidies, and we all celebrated it. We were happy. I remember Neil working on too many theories, modulation, ratcheting, and other theories that could sustain it. But then along the line, government allowed it to slide back, and subsidies came back, like you said, viciously. SURE-P was one thing that didn't work effectively well. I mean, comparing SURE-P with what Abacha did when Abacha was in government with his own version of SURE-P, the might effect are negligible. But it's all not about that. There are two things that are broken. There's no trust. Nobody trusts anything the government says. Nobody. I don't think government trusts itself. Even government doesn't trust itself. So that's one thing. So there's no trust. Then there's no credibility. No government has credibility enough to have an argument that is decent or can give a promise, because we are used to voting governments that will keep their promises. When we are voting, we already realize they will not keep their promises. It's part of our realization and awareness. So we can't say, okay, we'll build your roads, because they don't build them. We can't say things. And then the biggest lie is when they say the savings from subsidy. For me, that is why that trust has broken down. Because every time the government tells me the savings, I'm like, what do you call savings? Savings means I want to spend 10 naira and I spend 7 naira. Then I have 3 naira savings. That's what I call savings, right? If I want to spend 10 naira and I bought 20 naira and I spent 25 naira, how can I call that savings? When you say savings from subsidy, you're telling them a lie, because you have no savings. What you're doing is eliminating waste. So when I say the savings will flow back to the economy, but you never have the money to flow back to the economy. You borrow to sustain what you're doing. It's a loss you're eliminating. So when I say we want to build roads, then you don't build the roads. Then you say everything. Then you're not telling people they start paying tolls for roads going forward. So going forward now, by the next few months, there'll be tolls on roads. The last 4 years, you increase electricity tariffs. Everybody has tariffs have gone up issue. Nobody has died. So the point we're in now is government has to take a decision. It's not an argument decision. It's saying we will do this. Then citizens must demand more accountability and transparency. The weakest part of the link is citizenship that expects government to do right without demanding it. In their mind, it should follow through. But you live in an economy where you don't get anything if you don't scream and shout. And they don't scream and shout. So every time something happens, so they'll tell you, okay, pay more for this, you pay more for it. You grumble, you pay more, nothing improves. You pay more for that, nothing improves. The MITO process, which you know very much about, has occurred a lot. Well, what is the power? I mean, I've been on generator for the past 3 days or 4 days because there's a broken sound something. Yet I'm paying more premium on power. So there's no trust in anything. There's no expectation of government everything. So the only thing people hold on to is that petrol cost. They would either is their lights is the only thing they get, and that argument takes away all logical discussions. It would have been nice. Sorry. It would have been nice to say demonstrate. It would have been nice to say give us a demonstration, but with what? A government that cannot pay salaries.
Okay, so I hear you, Henry, and what you've laid out is some preconditions before we can even have this conversation, right? There's no trust. And I think, Neil was in our conversation a few days ago, you mentioned what Yemi Ademelekun of Enough is Enough, said to you about justice, that this is really about a lack of justice and so on. But assuming that the incoming administration is able to lay down all of those preconditions, demonstrate in some way, shape, or form, that it's bringing justice to this issue, that it's going to be transparent, that it will cut down on its own wastage before it demands on Nigerians to give up on it. Let's assume all of that were to be put in place. What are some of the models? What are some of the options that we have for reforming or repealing or removing the fuel subsidy? What are some of the things you've seen around the world in your experience on how other countries have done it?
Well, I think there are a bunch of different approaches which have been taken. But I mean, just to follow up on Henry's point, I think you're making a big assumption there that the government will do this. Henry's absolutely right. There's no trust. There's no trust and there's no credibility. But the way in which you build trust and the way in which you build credibility is by actually doing things. So the government shouldn't, spend a lot of time trying to persuade people that they're trustworthy, because people aren't going to trust them anyway. But people will trust them after they've actually done things, if they've actually delivered something. And if they don't deliver something, then they don't deserve the trust. So I think that is a precursor, but that doesn't mean that you have to, run a big communications campaign for a long period of time trying to persuade people to trust you. Just go ahead and do stuff that actually matters. But in terms of the options for reform, there are typically two ways in which the reforms have been done. One is to liberalize the downstream. That's the big bang approach. At the end of the day, it's a bit crazy that the government is in charge of gasoline prices. I mean, the government isn't in charge of the price of bread. It isn't in charge of most prices. So why does it want to actually set what the gasoline price is? This is just about the only price left that it feels that it needs to control somehow or another. It needs a little political tool to be able to control this so that it can say that it's doing something for the people. But all of the other markets function reasonably effectively without government interference. So liberalizing the downstream would be one way of eliminating subsidies forever. Well, of course, there would be a big price increase, but the big price increase would mean that the fuel was sold at a competitive rate, at a cost-reflective rate. The price would fluctuate up and down, depending on what happened to the exchange rate and what happened to international markets. So there will be a lot more volatility. So there's some big downsides to liberalizing. But on the other hand, the subsidies would be zero, because nobody's going to import fuel unless they can make money by selling it. And you get rid of the crazy corruption within of the NNPC and with the political elite amongst the current mechanism. And let's just remind ourselves what that mechanism is. At the moment, the NNPC is deducting fuel subsidies before it remits the money to the Federation account. So we talk about the government, but the government is an afterthought in this process. The oil revenue is used, and then the money for the fuel subsidy is deducted at source. And as a result, we can say, oh, there's no subsidy. Well, actually, almost all of the oil money is being spent just paying for the subsidy, and then everybody else gets the dregs. So so moving away from that system and liberalizing is one powerful approach. Got pros and cons. The other approach, if the government wants to retain control over prices, but get rid of the subsidy, is to move to some sort of formula-based mechanism. And this has been done in a few places where they'll say, we have a formula, we'll publish the formula, we'll have an independent body which will set the price, and they'll change the price every 2 weeks or every month or whatever it is, but reasonably frequently, sometimes every week. And it'll change it based on that formula. And we won't change that formula, no political interference in the formula. So South Africa uses a mechanism quite similar to this. They smooth prices over 3 months, and they just take the international price, add on a certain bunch of margins, which make the domestic refining industry happy. And then that's the price that fuel is sold at in South Africa. It fluctuates up and down with the world market, but they can smooth it a little bit over time, and they have the agreement of the marketing companies to do that. But it's cost reflective, so you've got effectively very few or no long-term subsidies. So those are the two mechanisms. You can either have a formula mechanism, or you can have a liberalization of a downstream. What you can't do is you can't get rid of the subsidies by bumping the price up by 100% or whatever it is, and then say, we fixed it, because it always comes back. It must come back because of the depreciation of the currency over time. So, and this is what many previous presidents have done. They've said, oh, I'll fix it. You know, even Buhari at the beginning of his term bumped up the price by a lot, and then said, oh, I've got rid of it. But of course it comes back. You know, there's 20% plus inflation in Nigeria. There's 4 or 5% inflation in the international market. The currency is going to slide. The subsidy will come back if you don't keep on adjusting the price.
So before I go to Henry, help me understand this. How does it come back? If what we're saying is we're leaving the fuel prices purely to demand and supply, you go source your refined petroleum product, you bring it in, you sell it for what the people are willing to buy, right? How does it come back? All we have is that the prices will go up when crude oil prices are high. It will come down where crude oil prices drop.
No, that's right. No, if you liberalize, then it won't come back. If you liberalize, then people are just buying and selling it for whatever the world market price is, and then you'll pay whatever you pay, and it won't come back. So that's the great advantage of liberalizing, is that it doesn't come back. You've killed the demon, and now you've got a system there where the subsidies are gone. What I meant was the habit of almost all the previous presidents, with the single exception of Obasanjo, was to come into office with a big subsidy problem, do a big price hike, tell everybody that you fixed the problem, and then keep the domestic price at the same level, and keep it at the same level. And if you keep it at the same amount of naira per liter, but you don't adjust it as time goes on, then eventually the depreciation of the currency will mean that that amount will give rise to subsidies, because it no longer cover the cost of the imports.
Exactly. Okay, and I guess that's what Henry kind of referred to in the technical term that the government lies to the people, because you haven't really fixed it. You've done a bait and switch. But Henry, just coming to you, because I know you did quite a bit of work on this. This using a formula to determine what the prices would be. You led a lot of work on that Kachukwu as minister, to try and do this. What worked in that structure? What didn't? And should it be something we should be exploring again, Henry?
Well, I think Neil has answered the question already. Let's review 2016. So you come in and say, well, we're taking a subsidy, but then you not cap the price. You say, okay, landing cost in Nigeria at that time was maybe 110 naira. And then you cap the price at 150, allowing marketers a 40 naira float. You can move between 120, 130, 140. Yeah. So at that point in time, your exchange rate is this amount of money. The general price of crude is this amount of money. So you made those assumptions that those stay static. But it doesn't happen, they don't stay static. Dollar depreciates or appreciates, price of products rise or diminish, then it makes nonsense. So for a period of time, there's what we call over recovery, when the government was making money from petroleum prices. For over 6 months, the government was making profits. At that point in time, Nigerians didn't care, but they were paying 135, 134. Then all of a sudden, something happens in the world. Let's imagine like an Ukrainian war or something happens, then everything changes. Then the price of petroleum becomes 175. Now you've capped it at 150. Then now you now start having under recovery. You don't want to tell people the truth. Instead of calling subsidy, say, oh, we're under recovering now. Because the landing cost at that time has moved to 150. But the whole problem stems from a mindset of thinking. You want to control something you should not be controlling.
Correct.
Something that is really not within your power. A country that has 4 exchange rates officially can't have a subsidy regime that works. You can't give some people currency, the dollar at 424, some others at 436, some others at 473, and then these some others can get at 758. So that's why all the other guys left the room and now NNPC to be the only importer. And NNPC has been the only importer of petroleum in the last 3-4 years, because only NNPC can do what Neil described: take what is ours, import with ours, and take something for themselves. No efficiency down the line, no value addition down the line, sell crude, use crude money to abate it, nothing to the federation account. And you have governors who sit down there, who because of political affiliation, who because of their desire to be relevant, who because of their corruption, I mean, I can say this, will not make a word. Why are you taking our money to something that I'm not benefiting from? Why are you allowing Zamfara subsidize Lagos State? Why are you allowing it to subsidize River State? Because the more cars a state has, the more consumption in the state, the more subsidies from other states, because we run a federal system, in quotes. And when you have a unitary price system, you are allowing states to subsidize another state, and there's no benefit at all. So the whole idea is the fact that you want to do something you don't have the capacity to do. And it's not subsidy alone that's the major problem. The rates of the foreign exchange will always come to it if you keep it artificial. Because your inability to intervene in that market is dependent on your crude sales. And if your crude sales are impaired by a subsidy, you can't intervene.
Correct.
And that's why you now start the seats of dual exchange rates, one rate for us through BTA and others, one rate for people who don't have access to government, and then there's profiteering, and there's all the things that happen. So there's a corruption in this, and a desire of government to enrich cronies, which is part of the arguments.
And so I hear you on that. But you see, I'm an eternal optimist, and I believe that there is always a way, and we're going to seek that way. We're going to switch very quickly to seek that way. Now, Neil, maybe one last point on this. The fact that we have the fuel subsidy in place is one of the reasons why our refineries, or we haven't had a lot of people invest in refineries because of that artificial rate. Can you explain that for the audience to understand? And then I'll come to Henry to say, would Dangote's refinery coming online, will that address, some of these issues that we're having? So what's the Neil, for you is, how does having a subsidy regime in place stop the licensees from building refineries?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there are 4 refineries and none of them work. Typical capacity usage is between 10 and 20%. These are in pretty terrible shape. They still employ a bunch of people, but they produce very little fuel. And the reason for that is simple, which is it's not a viable business model. You've got to buy your crude, and because crude is exported, you've effectively got to buy it at world prices. But then you have to produce a product, gasoline, which you're then going to try and sell at a massively subsidized price. Well, there's no way in which the moribund and inefficient refineries that Nigeria has, state-owned refineries that it has, are going to be able to produce fuel at the regulated price, at the subsidized price. So they lose money hand over fist. And so the game for the refineries is just to try and get more and more money for turnaround maintenance and tell us this constant lie that that actually the problem is that they've not had enough money for maintenance, and if we just get a little bit more money for maintenance, then we'll somehow or another be able to make the whole thing work. The business model is fundamentally wrong. But I'll leave Henry to talk about Dangote. But the Dangote case, I think, is a very, very interesting one, because, of course, in principle, Dangote should be very much in favor of a liberalization. What I fear is that he would be in favor of a liberalization for Dangote, and then suddenly everybody would complain about the fact that fuel was coming from abroad, and they would want to close the market for imports so that Dangote could supply the entire country. In which case, all you've done is transferred a rent from the pockets of some public officials to a private individual. But Henry will tell me if I'm right on that.
So Henry, let me shape the question for you, because, again, we solve all of our policy issues in beer parlors. And the argument here is, if Dangote is coming on stream and y'all have been complaining about, this hike in fuel subsidies because of imported fuel, Dangote is going to get his crude locally. Yeah. Why don't you give the discounted prices on crude to Dangote? He can produce locally and you sell it at the same price. What is wrong with that argument?
Well, let's start from the beginning. Dangote is not coming on stream until another 6 months more. I mean, there's a lot of lies. This is what the fundamental problem of Nigerian state is. They need to deceive people and lie to them. Now, you're going to commission a refinery that's not ready in another 11 days. You're going to commission something that is not plugged into the system, that has no feed, until you have a Dangote refinery that's been commissioned. And Nigerians will sit down in the beer parlors and wait for Dangote to solve our problems when he has no feed. When he has to find, he has a 600,000 barrels per day refinery, which at optimal capacity will produce 59 million liters of petrol. So 6,000 barrels of petrol of crude should give 9 million liters. Now the question is, where does he get that feed from? As I speak to you, there are no plug-in lines to any field for crude. So he's going to have to rely on the traditional ways of inefficiency, carrying crude on vessels, carrying crude in buckets, carrying crude in jerry cans to supply his refinery. Then when he finishes that refining, how is he going to feed back into the process? There is no connecting cable or connecting pipelines into the Nigerian system, which doesn't really exist anyway. And then you have Lekki, that is a mess as it is. Lagos is a mess as it is. You're going to have how many tankers leaving the refinery to come to where? To Apapa or to Ikeja or to anything. So there's going to be a massive disruption in our lives if that happens as is. So Dangote refinery still needs more time to get itself together before it comes on feed. So that is about Dangote refinery. And that's something, again, I talk about this inherent dishonesty in ourselves and not being truthful. Commission something that you shouldn't commission because you want to put the name on your plaque, and then after the name is on your plaque, people are expectant. As of now, it's already. Second thing you talked about earlier on is this change the price substitution. So instead of subsidizing consumption, subsidize production.
Production, yeah.
The country has no source of foreign exchange apart from crude. Every government says we will diversify. I've been in diversification since I was maybe 11 years old, but nobody has diversified anything. The dependence on earnings from crude is more and more and more. And sadly, this government has borrowed my children into slavery. You're going to have to pay that money from an earning. What earnings have you got? You hear lies every time. FRS has made so much more money. Okay, use the currency levels and ask if FRS is really making more money. Use the exchange rates. If you had FRS making 1 million at 120 and they're now making 4 million at 480, have they made more money? Can that money meet your need? Is sufficient enough? So you have a revenue challenge. You heard somebody saying, oh, we have a revenue challenge. You have a revenue challenge. You have a debt challenge. Both challenges are real. And your debt challenge is not solved by the policies you are making. You're pushing the can down the road from the government. You're taking the excuse problem. So let's now put in the economics of production of petrol. I've told everybody, Foster, my program, did a research commission to show how much a liter of petrol will become if this locally. The variance wasn't that much. If Dangote buys crude price at international prices, which we can try not to sell at, then you can shift subsidy, but you're still subsidizing something. And when you do that, you're going to impair, and as Neil said, you're transferring rent from all of us to somebody else. And every time, I was shocked some 3-4 years ago when we and my team went to EMT, and they were telling us, Dangote refinery ready 2019. I said, no, it's already 2019. That was 2017. I'm like, how are you planning on Dangote refinery? It can't be ready. It's not ready. We've been there. We've seen it. I said, no, 2019 was 2019. This is 2023. Every time the goalpost shifted, we told you the refineries they're repairing would be ready by this. But the fundamental issue is, why should government spend money it doesn't have on something the private sector can do? Mm-hmm. In a place where you have constraints on finances, government should exit markets where private sector can function. There's no reason why government.
So the point really is that for the private sector to come into this refining market, you must remove the subsidy.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So, and there's private sector funds are enormous.
Yeah.
There are funds that are coming every day that can go to that sector, save government its own foreign exchange, save its own funds. There was only them giving 20 billion or 2 billion, whatever, $2 billion to Dangote, $2 billion to Dangote. There wasn't any need for that. If the banks thought this thing was viable, they would have found the money. So the problem is that we don't exit corruption. That's my point. Okay.
So where I have arrived in my understanding of what both of you have said is that, number one, we've got to do two things. One, deregulate, which basically means take away that, subsidy. And secondly, if you can't do the first one, then use some kind of formula, to drive pricing. But we've already tried the formula system in Nigeria and it hasn't worked. So let's now focus on the first. But Henry, you worked for many years at NNPC trying to figure out the formula thing.
Yeah, they didn't apply it.
I didn't work with NNPC.
Henry, you need to answer.
No, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, Neil and I and other team members did a lot of work on modulation prices. We did ratcheting, we did smoothing. When you talk about Africa, we presented all those options. We had a lot of papers, and we had a lot of time we spent in NNPC with the boardroom, with the war room on strategy and other things. But the government decided to take the simplest approach, high prices. Now, the only way forward for us now, and I'm sad to say the only way forward, get out of that space. Yeah. You need to regulate quality. You need to regulate extortion. You don't regulate price anymore. Get out of that space.
Okay.
Leave that space.
I agree with that with one caveat. I think that the government needs to get out of this space. The question is whether it does it overnight or whether the price increase is staggered.
Okay, so that's
the world market and the current one is very high. And if we do it overnight, it'll kill people.
That's the question I want us to get to now, right? How do we then remove the price? Do we do it just yank off the Band-Aid, deal with it, and move on? Or is it a graduated? What are the pros and cons for each of these options, Neil?
So there's a lot of international experience on that. And that's always the debate. And the debate always goes like this. It says, well, we need to do it gradually because, if you don't do it gradually, then it'll be a big shock. And then other people say, no. If we do it gradually, then there'll be a political opposition which will mount and you'll never actually do it.
Correct.
And there's always this tension between these two debates. But fortunately, we actually have now quite a lot of empirical experience of this. The governments that have gone for the Big Bang approach, where they've just ripped off the plaster and said, right, this is what we're going to do, it very often fails. It very, very often fails. If you do the Big Bang approach, particularly for a large adjustment, you get huge amounts of pushback, very understandably. And so it's very difficult to successfully do a very big reform unless you have staggered it and prepared people in advance. So I remember I lived for some years in Indonesia, and the former president of Indonesia, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who used to be known as SBY, because his name was so long, SBY knew that he had to remove the fuel subsidies, and he knew it would be very unpopular. So he started talking about it. And all the economists said to him, you've got to do it in a big bang, otherwise people will smuggle and they'll all see these bad things. Do it in a big bang. He didn't do it in a big bang. He talked about it, and he talked about it, and he talked about it, and he talked about it. He talked about it actually for a year. Every single time, he just kept on saying, this is what's going to happen. By the time he eventually did the reform at the end of a year, everyone was so bored of hearing him talking about it. They went, oh yeah, we knew that was going to happen. There were no protests. So I think if you do it in a massive Big Bang, you'll get a 2012 type of experience. And that's the last thing you need, because that burns your credibility. But on the other hand, you mustn't do it. You mustn't stretch it out too long. My personal view is the government should spend 3 to 6 months talking about it, explaining it, explaining what is going to be done, explaining how the compensation should be done, explaining what the benefits of it will be, explaining what positive things are going to be produced, even if people don't believe them, as a result of the money that will be released from the subsidy. And they should do it in step by step. And the steps should go along with compensation so that the poor are protected. But then when they finally get to the world market price, then liberalize. Don't try and use a formula from then, because if you use a formula from then, come election time, someone will manipulate the formula and you'll be back at square one. So that's my view, is do it gradually, but then within 6 months to a year, then liberalize.
Henry, what's the argument against this? Knowing our political economy, right? Knowing how politicians will always take the easy way out, knowing how the opposition can latch on to this and make it a political issue. What's the argument against Neil's position?
Well, exactly what Neil said is the argument against it as well. Like you said, Nigeria has a problem. Interventions become permanent. The whole subsidy thing started with intervention based on the war, the Israeli Arab war.
1973 war. Yeah.
That's why we got subsidy. It was supposed to be intervention by the government then it's permanent.
6 months. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was 6 months intervention designed, and then it became this. Because again, there's an attitude of profiteering from crisis. What you said, and what Neil said is what I discussed earlier this morning with some other colleagues. My argument was, the longer you take to do it, the more corruption creeps into it. But I also totally agree, if you do it once now, the system can't take the shock. Now, that's why they don't give you malaria medicine in one injection, or they give injections staggered, so that over some time. So if you do it, it shouldn't be more than a space of 6 months. Because the longer you delay, the longer there's creep. And when creep comes in, corruption will come in as well. And like you said, the political system will extort it. But there's a question which we are shying away from. The more legitimacy you have as a government, the easier this decision is. You cannot have this kind of one ban-aid removal when you are struggling for legitimacy. Remember that we are still at the point where we have not resolved election issues, and we have not legitimacy issues resolved. Yeah. So every government that's not careful and does something that has such an impact on people would cause something that is seismic and that can be affected by itself. So there's a lot of thinking that goes to it. Now, what I would suggest is what I suggested, and it's basically the same thing I said every time. Sensitize people about we want to do it. Then do it. Okay. Do it gently, then do it once and move on.
Okay, so we've got some questions in the chat room, and please, if you're listening and you have some questions, post it there. I'll read it out. I'll acknowledge you. This is from Dr. Chike Mogulim, and he says, if government chooses to embark on this deregulation policy leading to subsidy removal, how does it plan to provide the US dollars that will enable petroleum traders to continue to import these products into Nigeria? Maybe Neil, you can take that.
Thank you very much, Chike. And it's a good question, because there's a linkage between the issue of access to US dollars and the liberalization of the downstream. Currently, the NNPC are the only importer, and they've got preferential access to Forex. And still, they don't necessarily always have enough, and that's one of the reasons why we end up with shortages. After deregulation, the market price should be profitable for importers. That's the whole meaning of the market price. So an importer can sell in Naira, take the Naira to the central bank, pay the full market exchange rate for the US dollars, use this to buy the fuel, and still have some profit afterwards. That's what a market exchange rate means. And of course, if the government continues to overvalue the exchange rate and ration US dollars, which is what it has been doing, then the shortages will continue, and some people will get very rich from the process. And so a successful liberalization of the market for gasoline requires that traders require the government to allow currency to reflect the market value as well. In other words, you have to have a currency market. You've got to bring together the parallel rate and the official rate. You may not be able to do that overnight either. but you've got to bring those things together in order for the liberalization to be effective.
I mean, and I think this kind of dovetails into his second question, which you've kind of touched on, but maybe you can expand on it a little bit. And Dr. Chike says, with the present poor US dollar reserves of the Central Bank of Nigeria, the only option for petroleum product importers will become the parallel market. You know, how deep is the market? What do you think will happen to exchange rates in that market?
Yeah, and again, it's this issue of access. That access problem goes away whenever you merge the parallel market and the official rate. But that again is something which will take a little bit of time, and so it's a reform that has to be done in parallel with the liberalization. That's what there is 6 months. I mean, as Henry has said, if you do it over a course of 6 months, you can reconcile the exchange rates and you can bump up the domestic price, and then you can liberalize at a point where the official rate is already equal to the parallel rate. If you did it upfront, then what would happen, of course, is because there's a shortage of dollars in the parallel market, you would end up with a spike in the price for those dollars, and that will then trigger inflation. But you know, the reason the US reserves are low is because the exchange rate's overvalued. The parallel and official rates need to be brought back together. And that, of course, if you were to do so, would encourage exports, which generate US dollars, and it would discourage imports, which consume US dollars, and that would bring the reserves back into a more sensible balance. It's not an easy reform. It's a structural reform, and it'll be painful, but it has to be part and parcel of the reform.
Neil, I guess the summation to your answer is that there are no easy solutions here.
Unfortunately,
and any government that's inheriting these problems, you know, should know that there are no easy answers, and it's got to dig deep to get the technical answers, but also dig deep to show a sense. It's going to put some political capital on the line. But Henry, maybe the last question I'll take from Dr. Chike, and this directed to Henry, is, you know, what's your prediction about poverty levels if the subsidy is removed? You know, so we've all said we need to do it, whether it's gradual, whether it's a band, you know, pull out the band-aid immediately. What will happen to poverty levels if this happens? Henry?
Well, I mean, there's a need to be sincere with the subsidy. What levels have become worse? It hasn't changed. It's becoming worse. Every year with this last government, they have been increasing poverty levels. You can't link that to subsidy. Poverty is not addressed by only one initiative or by one things. And surprisingly, those that are in the poverty levels don't live on dollars. There's a point I want to emphasize that for Dr. Chike. As I speak today, the other products like kerosene, like diesel, like aviation fuel, are imported by people who don't have access to central bank rates. And they find the dollars. The dollars exist in the market because the dollars are there. The only reason why they are not importing petrol is because they cannot compete with NNPC. Because NNPC gets at 4 something, they have to buy at 740.
Correct.
But for diesel and kerosene and others that are liberalized, they bring it in. There's no shortage of diesel in the last 4 years. There's no shortage of kerosene. We've not had any queue. Now for the petrol that's highly subsidized with dollars, there's always been the queue. This last 2 years have been the worst. We've had queues in Abuja. You live in Abuja as I do. You know how terrible we've had it in the last 2 years. So it's not the dollar exchange. It's not one decision that affects all. But even maybe where to start from is that dollar market. Now about poverty is even deepened by continued subsidy. When you continue subsidy, you leave the government no money for social interventions. I tell everybody, when he was my boss, and he's still my boss, one day we were talking about school fees. I think we were in London. And I told him how much I pay on my kids' school fees. And then it was like, oh, no wonder you have to work so hard. The middle class problem we all have is school fees. Once you have your income beginning of the year, you start sweating school fees. Now, where Neil is, I'm sorry, Neil, if I say this, and it's not supposed to be public information. He lives in Oxford, in a neighborhood where schools are. People choose locations they live in UK based on the schools sometimes. They might pay higher tax rates, but the guys get to schools. Now, healthcare, you and I say this every time, and it was from you I heard it for the first time, Patrick. The average Nigerian is only poor until there's sickness. Yeah. Once sickness and you're wiped out. Once in Nigeria, all your money is gone. You and I also have a challenge now. All our kids, when we can afford it, go to school. There was kids in Sudan. We had 5,000 Nigerian schooling in Sudan or 7,000. There are kids everywhere. The Nigerian economy supports UK economy in schools, significant amount of revenue. So support US, support Ghana, and co. These are things that lead to poverty. These are reasons why a lot of us are really poor. We've seen, when I was working on the UK project years on in my development career, we realized the poor even want quality education and co. Now, if you take out where we spend our money, what do you have left? I was in Brazil a month ago. At the airport, I knew Brazil had free healthcare. How did I know? I saw drivers wearing braces. I saw people, ticket attendees wearing braces. Braces is a middle-class purchase in Nigeria. It costs you an average of 800 to 1.6 million naira for braces for a child. So when I see local keepers wearing braces, as I saw in Brazil, I said, oh, you guys have free healthcare. They have free healthcare and co. Now, when healthcare is solved, you have revenue to support healthcare. You have revenue to support education. I mean, the schools are in shambles. There's no money. There are no roads. So the subsidy itself is deepening poverty. Now, It does not mean that prices won't rise. People actually price rise with poverty. But prices have been rising every time. Prices are rising everywhere in the world. Bread keeps on rising. Chicken, egg today, you can't find feed for eggs. But the whole thing is linked to a simple decision of government not do the right thing. I get the passion.
So I hear you loud and clear. But there's a question here from Gani Tiamiu of Vios Energy, and I'll direct it to you, Neil, right? He says, I do agree subsidies need to be removed, but would it be positive? Would it be a positive step to find a way to support the poor, right? How have other countries achieved removal of subsidy with support for the vulnerable while they adjust to the new prices? So again, looking at your experience, a lot of it documented in your book. And let me say again that the link to the book is in the chat room and you can download it for free. But in your review of how countries have removed their subsidies, what are some of the things they gave to the poor, to enable that reform to happen?
So the answer is a great question. Thank you, Gani. I think it's essential to provide some compensation, some palliatives, as we say in Nigeria, for the poor. It's not really palliative, it's keeping people alive, because the shock would be substantial for the poor, and they're already in a very tough place. I mean, I read recently that 63% of Nigerians are now poor by the multidimensional poverty index. This is horrendous. So ensuring that the people in the bottom half of the distribution of the country are not terribly affected by the price rises that would result from the subsidy is essential. There are lots of ways of doing this, and lots of countries have done this. There was actually quite a nice study done a year or two ago, which looked at several different examples of subsidy reform in different countries. And what they found was that while there were all sorts of problems associated with subsidy reform, there were no examples of successful subsidy reform that didn't provide some kind of compensation for the poor. So if you fail to provide compensation for the poor, you are inviting a riot. You have to do something to help the people at the bottom end deal with the shock that will inevitably come. Not all reforms around the world have always done this, but it is good practice to have something. And it's doable. You can put in place. I mean, I know people are very critical of cash transfers, for example. Everyone sort of points at the World Bank and says, "Well, they always go on about cash transfers." And that's true. The World Bank seems to think cash transfer is a solution for pretty much everything. But the World Bank are right in that providing amounts of cash for a temporary period of time to poor households, and not just poor households, actually. I mean, pretty much everybody in the bottom 40 or 50% of the population is essential, I think, to help people tide them over. You can't continue this forever, but it is good practice.
So Neil, let me help you frame that point a little bit. We have tried cash transfers in Nigeria. Their success rate is open to debate. Right?
Well, that's very politely put.
Yeah, I'm being diplomatic here. How do you do cash transfers in a country where you cannot identify anyone, right? And
I don't think that's true. I think you can identify people. It's
okay.
not easy. And sometimes economists get rather obsessed with the targeting process and the leakages in the targeting process here. But actually identifying the people in the bottom half of the distribution is a lot easier than identifying the bottom 10%. You know, we're not quibbling about whether or not you're on $0.50 a day or $1 a day here. I mean, whether you're on $0.50 a day or $1 a day, you're still really poor. So compensate people. And the larger share of the population who you provide some support for. You know, if you provide 5,000, 10,000 naira a month for 3 to 6 months, something like that, it will make a difference for the people at the bottom. It will not make any difference at all for the people in the top 20%. That's nothing. But for the people in the bottom half of their distribution, that's the difference between life and death. So I think it's essential to have that, but it's also essential to have other things. I mean, the truth of the matter is that if you're targeting cash towards the poor, people will spend it hopefully on food or maybe on their kids' education or whatever and so forth. But the average working person in an urban area, you know, 5,000 naira is not going to go very far. What they need is to make sure that their bus fare is affordable. So you need other interventions. I mean, I noticed one of the other chats was about buses. I'm not sure we want to follow go the Sure-P way of buying lots of buses. You know, you can see all these rusting Sure-P buses still in various different places in Nigeria. But why don't we have a mechanism of subsidizing public transport in the key cities where people would otherwise be terribly affected by large bus price rises? All that requires is a negotiation with the providers of the public transport, which is a much smaller group. You can manage to do that, and you can keep prices at a certain level, and you can use social pressure to make sure that they don't rise. So you need measures like that to compensate people, to help people adjust to the shock. And I think it's essential.
Yeah, and there are some other ideas that I've worked in other places where you can use like a bus card, you know, and the only way you get the bus card is you get registered and we have your tax information, etc. And there could be other benefits to government, you know, when you do that. But let me go to Henry. What else can we do to properly target the poor and ensure that if whatever pains come from the removal is kind of soothed by these programs? What else, you know, have you seen that has worked out there?
Well, I mean, this argument I enjoy because Nigeria, again, it's complex and complicated. Everything just comes and complicated, sadly. Just some months ago, we had COVID-19, and COVID-19 had interventions to target the poor, and there was a lot of palliatives, and there were cash transfers as well. So again, I totally agree that identifying the poor is not a difficult thing. There's sincerity in the process. Everybody knows where the poor live, and you can bring them on board. And with the level of internet penetration in Nigeria and banking penetration, you can bring everybody into the bank system. It's an advantage thing. So giving the people cash transfers is not a problem. But there's an argument that is missing, which the enough is enough, and all CSOs and always tell us when we discuss subsidy: justice. Any government that wants to target any reform around subsidy must start with justice. People must be punished for those who have stolen money and palliatives and such. That is the first way of bringing in trust into the system. Because when I heard about the idea of this post cards and everything, yeah, it will work. But I know Nigerians, anything you introduce like that becomes a gaming system approach. And where there is no justice, it will continue. So I think one of the things anybody needs to do is justice. But I'm also a supporter of improving the quality of education and health. When I was in the British Council UB project, the World Bank project, we found that in Lagos, we didn't want to put private schools under the World Bank initiative and support because we were targeting public schools. But then when we went down to the poorest of the poorest areas in Lagos State, and we found out that the poorest of the poorest would even give their children money to pay for school rather than attending free schools in Lagos. We have to bring in private schools into the system. Now, again, I know that once people are sure of health and education, then the other thing is just feeding. And when you give them 5,000 or 10,000, they will spend it on food, which is not a bad thing to do, and make that easy. But the challenge you have is when you don't solve the nexus problems, which are complicated as well, that money doesn't go to anything else. It becomes paltry, and then the system games itself. So I believe in cash transfers. I believe in subsidizing social infrastructure. I believe in ensuring that access to markets are reduced. As I speak to you today, if you're in the poultry business, you can't find food. An egg today is production cost of an egg is more profitable, is less profitable than the price of selling an egg. Bread, same thing. These are the things the poor need to eat. You have all the things that are there. Can you put interventions in agriculture that not the ones that you be giving people loan that they won't pay back and things? You can do a commodity exchange system, where commodity exchange systems where you buy from the farmers, you pay the farmers, you sell to the markets, the poor buy, and we do that. You can do social food stamps and code and everything. Just take away where they spend their money. Where does the poor spend half of his income? Even the middle class in Nigeria today spends 65% of his income on feeding. The so-called middle class, so-called, because that's what is a nebulous thing.
There's no middle class in Nigeria.
There's no middle class.
But Henry, you talked about people in Lagos spending money in sending their kids to private schools instead of the government schools, and I just posted something in the chat on this great book on this subject, The Beautiful Tree, A Personal Journey into How the World's Poorest People Are Educating Themselves, by Professor Tully. Great book on how to use private markets to solve the education problem. But I wanted to go to another question in the chat room, and this is really about the policy brief. Neil just posted in the chat room on, it was developed by the policy practice, fossil fuel subsidy reforms policy brief number 15. And, Neil posted the link to the policy brief. And Damilola Abayomi, raised the point on this policy brief. He said, he's gone through the brief, even as we talked. The 5-point approach shared in the brief were well summarized. They are practical. They have a global approach to end subsidies. I might also add that the sufficient focus and resources should also be made towards non-fossil fuel alternatives in the long run. One concern, however, is that the government must have a strong political will, not only to pull this off by a sustainable approach, but also to prevent a re-emergence, considering the Indonesian situation. And he said, can we look at tackling these issues with global and regional laws? And that's what caught my attention. In your experience, Neil, have you seen where countries, first of all, are there global laws, that deal with these issues? And have you seen where countries have leaned on those to drive their reforms?
Yes, thank you, Damilola. It's a very good question. So there's two aspects to this. One is, are there alternatives, non-fossil alternatives to fossil fuels? The single thing that would make Nigeria more sustainable in terms of using less fossil fuel would be a fossil fuel subsidy reform. At the moment, gasoline is far too cheap. And as a result, the huge amounts of gasoline are used, more than 50 million liters a day. And of course, if the price were to be reflecting of the true cost of gasoline, not just the actual market price, that would be a start, but then all of the externalities, as economists call them, so all of the pollution, all of the congestion, all of the accidents, all of the global warming that is caused by burning it, then all of a sudden it wouldn't be so attractive and people would be shifting towards other problems. I don't think we're going to see a massive shift towards electric transportation yet in Nigeria, because you have to have a power sector that functions, and that's another whole debate. But nonetheless, it would have a positive development. But you raise a very important issue of sustainability, and how do we achieve a sustainability? There are two international fora through which that has been done. On the fossil fuel subsidy side of things, the G7 and the G20 have made all sorts of commitments about how fossil fuels should be eliminated. This has been almost entirely ineffective. Every single year, the G7 and the G20 get together. Since 2009, they've had a little sentence in there saying that they're going to do their best to try and eliminate inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Saudi Arabia insisted that the word inefficient was included. Nobody has ever defined what an efficient fossil fuel subsidy was. And as a result, the world has just got more and more and more subsidies. So just to give you an indication, back around about 2009, total subsidies in the world were around about $500 billion. Now, last year, there were well over $1,000 billion, so $1 trillion, 6% or so of global GDP being spent on fossil fuel subsidies. It's completely crazy and very, very unsustainable. So a fossil fuel subsidy reform would help that. The one thing which has worked, and you'll see that on the chapter on country experience in the book, is climate laws. Climate laws have actually been quite effective, and there's a number of studies being done now where countries have committed themselves to say, okay, well, we're going to take climate change seriously, and that means we're going to make the following sectoral changes, and we have to actually comply with them legally. Then it's possible for people to use the legal system, if the legal system works, to hold governments to account. Well, in Nigeria, the legal system is frequently used to hold the government to account, and sometimes it can be quite an effective way of doing so. So, you know, maybe Nigeria should think about what sort of things it would be willing to commit to in a climate law appropriate for Nigeria. You know, Nigeria is a huge gas and oil state. It's not about to give these things up overnight. But on the other hand, by committing itself in that way, it could spur huge amounts of climate finance. And climate finance could help cushion the blow associated with a transition away from fossil fuels.
Sure.
So I think climate laws do have a role for trying to encourage the transition. I think platitudes by the G20 and G7 do not.
Yeah, and I have a question here that I'm going to direct to Henry. It's from Victor Aliko. He's an analyst with Next Year. He said, Nigeria has gotten approval to borrow $800 million from the World Bank to give to 10 million Nigerians for the first 6 months out of the 47 million in the social register. How significant can this be to the poor if inflation would eat up these cash transfers? Can we look at alternative sources of revenue, like increasing our tax base and revisit the voluntary asset and income declaration scheme to get the rich to pay more taxes rather than remove the subsidy? Victor, Henry.
Yeah. So I think we can do all together. I believe that $800 million is money that can be well spent if there's focus. I support transfers of cash. I mean, look, again, let's bring it local. Each of one of us here in this room, most of us here in this room and this space, we're a local government to many people. Many of us on a monthly basis have people we give 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 real sums for upkeep. And that's true. There's very few of us who have no dependents, where we don't give upkeep to them. And we know that money can be a difference between life and death for them. If you know how the aged either have either diabetic or hypertensive, you realize that that's small amount of money will buy them the drugs that keep them alive. So it's very important that we don't take away the importance of people having cash transfers, because we all do it. I mean, each working person in Nigeria has about 6 people attached to him that he has to do cash transfers to. So it's already working in the model. So I think what is important is there's transparency in management, there's transparency in administration of the poor and everything. Now to sustainability, the question about the poor, the rich paying more or the middle class paying more and voluntary institution, I believe it can be done together. I like the fact that today I read in papers that Abuja, FCIRS, has mandated a tax certificate for many transactions. You cannot apply for dollars for travel without tax certificate. You can't do this, you can't do that. That means a lot more people will be captured in the net. But again, there's also that shrinking income of the middle class that must be there as well. So there's a level you can tax people to before you get them to become criminals and others. But I think you can do all in conjunction. You can't do not only one thing. You can do the HML. It's a good thing. It's a good kind of sum of money. People should be protected. There are vulnerable people in Nigeria who that money makes a significant impact upon a lot of people. So that's my position on that.
Okay, so I have some comments from CQ Aliu, and he's preferring solutions, and I'd like to get a view on this. He said, and he has a number of them. Number one, short-term solutions. Take a loan of between $3.6 to $7.2 billion to buy between 18,000 and 36,000 buses, which is like 500 to 1,000 buses per state, rather than give the money to individuals, which will not which will not address the issue, distribute these buses to private transporters at very low interest. This fund can be substantially reduced if Innocent Motors and other local bus manufacturers are allowed to import knockdown parts and assemble in Nigeria solely for this purpose. Government should then use the savings from the subsidy to improve infrastructure like trains, waterways for passengers, cargo, and road improvement. What is the argument against this position, Neil?
I think I agree with the second part of it. I think it's a great idea to use the money from the subsidy to invest heavily in infrastructure and in all manner of other improvements, because ultimately that kind of investment can spur growth. I think it's history has taught us that buying buses or giving subsidized loans in order to be able to private transporters to be able to get them is not necessarily the most effective way of really using the subsidy funds, for the simple reason that it disappears. I mean, once you've given your subsidized loan, who knows what it gets used for? Oh, we bought a bus for it. Oh, well, did we really buy a bus for that, or were we going to buy a bus anyway? So it's very difficult to know whether the benefit is really there, and you have to put in place some sort of complicated mechanism for tracking whether the benefit was actually there. The great advantage of cash, I know people are often reticent about cash, but the great advantage of cash is that more people know what they need. Well, all of us know what we need. You know, if you give me 10,000 naira, then I go out and I spend 10,000 naira on the things that I need, because I know what I need. And that's true whether you're middle class, even though there's no middle class, or if you're poor, or if you're better off. So if you give people some cash to help them tide over, then it helps them. As Henry says, it can be a difference in life and death. It isn't the only solution, and I agree with Henry that there are other things. Public transport and subsidizing public transport is one of them. Maybe things in the agricultural sector as well, which would improve access to food, would be a good idea as well. There's all sorts of manner of things. And I think the government needs to think carefully about what package of measures should be introduced in order to try and ensure two things. First of all, that the poor are protected, but secondly, that the middle class, the people in the middle, who are mostly in urban areas, who have loud voices and who are important for the maintenance of the regime of the administration, must be satisfied. So I think there is a tendency within the World Bank and various other development partners to say, oh, it's just about the poor, it's just about the poor. Well, listen, everybody votes. So it's important that the people in the middle are also seeing that the government cares for them. And that's why there has to be a panoply of measures, but I wouldn't buy buses.
Okay, and I think we've tried that idea in the past. I think it was under IBB that we tried the Federal Urban Mass Transit Scheme. Under Shopee, we tried it again, and in either of these cases, they didn't work. But Henry, this is coming to you. Let's spend a little bit of time to kind of unpack this whole idea that the people will go to the street and revolt, right? If you did any form of painful reforms. I think it was some data from NOI polls back in 2013, 2014 that tracked every month, you know, if the reform was done, if Nigerians will take to the streets. Between 2012 and 2015, in 2012, 60% of Nigerians said they were not going to support the reforms. By 2015, it dropped to 50%. Of that 50%, 26% said they would, you know, take to the streets. 24% said, you know, they'll be pissed, but they're not going to take to the streets. So I wonder if we have really interrogated this big fear of demonstrations that, you know, may lead to cries for regime change, as we saw in 2012, or if it's just a myth that we've carried in our heads and we haven't really interrogated. What do you think, and have you seen any data to that effect, Henry? Okay,
first of all, I haven't seen any data. I can only use street experience, so there's no data I have seen about that. But what I would say, for instance, is in the power sector, in the last 2-3 years, there has been price increases at shocking levels. There's nobody on the streets. I mean, anybody that buys units knows that he pays more to buy less. Nobody has gone to the streets. And power is an essential part of reducing poverty. Access to energy is an essential part of reducing poverty in the country. And yet, with the MITO and others, nobody has reported on anything. The price of bread and yam and co have gone up 200%, 300%. Nobody has reported. The price of school fees has gone up for everybody. Nobody has reported. The price of being alive has gone. Everybody's revolting. Now, what spurs a revolt is not actually a reform. What spurs a revolt is the politics of the reform. It has never been about the reform itself. It's been the politics of the reforms in Nigeria that spurs a revolt. Whether it's SAP riots of 1987, whether it's the 2012 subsidy protest, it wasn't the reform that led the revolt. It was the politics of it. Once you manage the politics of it properly, then nobody wants to revolt. But once the politics of it are bad, then the revolt is engineered because of the crisis.
Sure.
So an instance now where we haven't resolved NSAS issues properly. There's a lot of young people angry about how the NSAS issue was well handled. It wasn't well managed. Such things are triggers for anger. It will now take a life of its own. We haven't resolved these elections properly. People still debate on who won, who didn't win, who was supposed to win. There's still a lot of religious sentiments around our elections, where people are still, either whatever they're doing on those issues. Those are political issues.
Sure.
What a subsidy reform will do is trigger the politics, which leads to the street thing. But the reform, well managed subtly, well done, adjusted properly, who cares? We'll survive, we'll crumble in pain, like we're gobbling about power now. Everybody now, I'm unhappy about how much I'm paying for electricity tariffs, but there's nobody joining me on the streets. I'd like to fight NEPA, PHCN, or whatever they're called, Abuja Disco. But you see, but I have no data about it. But I don't think it's reforms. I think it's politics that cause reports.
Okay, so let me get a few more questions in before we have to pack it up. And this goes again to Henry, and it's from Bayo Olarinwaju Alo. And I'll read his point and then I'll frame the question. He says, the reform will bring pain to Nigerians. Government and the political class must, in caps, share in the pain by ensuring that they also pay for the energy they use from their income and not the taxpayers. Also, deliberate effort to reduce waste in government activities and projects. Government should also provide social safety nets for the poor, etc., etc. The point I took out from here goes back to some of the points you made, Henry, earlier on, which is some of the conditions for reform, right? And the point he's bringing out here is, how does government demonstrate that it has plugged the wastages, plugged the leakages, it's taking on some of the pain that would demonstrate to Nigerians that government has maxed out on all the places where we're wasting money, and the only other place to cut is the fuel subsidy? Are there some things government can do that would demonstrate that, and then that could buy them the political space to drive the reforms? Henry.
Totally agree with you with the person who asked the questions or suggested the idea. One of the challenges we have is government says take the pain, but they don't take any injection. The government said we'll sell private jets, and sell anything. All these things are symbolic. I'm as an economist, and the numbers when you cut expenditure on salaries and co is not significantly high. But you can't tell people to do things without even doing symbolic things. Governance is both what you do, interpretation, and symbolism. Now you have a government where the new set of senators will come in and buy new cars, give themselves car allowances and such. You tell Nigerians take the pain. You have a president who will leave the Maybach Buhari road and buy their own new Maybachs in a country where we're this poor, where you see the convoy of a president of 28 cars or 30 cars. You have these kind of things that they are symbolic reforms government ought to do. You cut the cost of governance, you cut wastage and expenditure, strengthen the public procurement process. The last person who had any seriousness about public procurement was Obasanjo. And that's one of the why his reforms actually went through. But other governments have played lip service to public procurement and have allowed public procurement to become rubbish. Where are the biggest elements of corruption right now? Public procurement. Design a system that strengthens that area, where there's a fingerprint on it. There's somebody who knows when this is being bought, and we're cutting expenditure on these areas. There's symbolic issues. But when you don't do all that, and it's business as usual, you give people that travel, directors $400 extra code. Every training you want is in Zambia or Jan something and everything. You have 5 business class and first class. Why do you not tell me to take the pain? So there are things they can do. They are symbolic, in fact, that they don't have significant effect. on effects, but it gives people that sense of we are in it together.
Yeah.
But that's why that doesn't happen.
And symbolism matters. I mean, a few weeks ago, I posted something on social media about being on a flight with an ambassador of a European country that had engaged next year to do some work. And he was on a private trip with his wife, and he was in economy. And a director in a ministry that we supported was in business class, that we supported with the funding that came from this ambassador or from this embassy. And I thought, that was a great juxtaposition of some of the challenges we face in Nigeria. But Neil, this question is for you, and maybe you can use it again to kind of wrap up our conversation this afternoon. A little bird just whispered to me that the incoming president is going to be reaching out to you to advise him on how to reform Nigeria's fuel subsidy regime. What do you, just so bring it all together for him, you're in an elevator, you're going to finish your pitch before you get to his floor. What should he do? I know it's complicated, but what are you going to say to him?
Thanks for that, Patrick. I would say 5 things. I'd say number 1, you've got to communicate about it. Talk about it. Okay, say why it's a problem. Say why you're going to fix it. Say what the benefits of fixing it are going to be. Be clear about what the timetable of doing it is going to be. So communicate, 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 communicate. Don't shy away from it. Everyone always says, oh, no, we can't possibly talk about that. It's too sensitive. It's too political. Of course it's political. That's why you have to talk about it. Number 2, fashion an offer that appeals to the bulk of Nigerians who are in the middle. Not just the poor, but fashion an offer, whether that offer is paying for school fees, whether that offer is free healthcare, whether that offer is building the roads, I don't know, but something which is politically attractive. This is what President Jokowi in Indonesia did. We went around and said, I'm going to do the subsidy reform, but I'll give you health and I'll give you education. And he had 2 little cards. He took them out at every rally that he did. So there needs to be an offer that is tailored for Nigerians, that will appeal to Nigerians. And the incoming president will know better than I do what will really appeal. Number 3, do the reform in steps. So don't bump with a massive price rise, but say, right, we're going to fix this over 6 months, bang, bang, bang. Do the Indian approach. This is what they did. And they said, okay, we're going to get rid of this. This month it's going to be this. Then the next month it's going to be that. Then the next month's going to be that. And step by step, they move things up. So do it in steps. Then when the subsidy is finally removed, when the price is up to a world market level, then liberalize the sector. You'll have 6 months to plan the liberalization of the sector. Be prepared so that when you're up to the world market price, you can liberalize, let go, and walk away from that sector and let the private sector supply gasoline. And finally, and I love Henry's point about justice and accountability, put someone in jail. Billions have been stolen from the fossil fuel subsidy regime over the last decades and decades and decades. Now 50 years, you just reminded me at the beginning, and so forth. A lot of that money has been stolen recently. The new president will be perfectly well aware of some of the people who have been responsible for that. Put somebody in jail. Show the people that you actually care about accountability. Doing those 5 things, I think we've got a chance. Like Excellent. You, I'm an optimist. We'll see.
Thank you so much, Neil. And just to ask Henry the same questions. Is there something that Neil has left out that you want to say to the incoming president on how to drive these reforms and make it stick this time?
I think I share Neil's opinion. The first thing is understand the issues properly. What I realized that a lot of them don't understand the issues properly. There's an assumption that there's understanding. And I always find it funny that people outside government always think people in government are stupid and dumb. Every time you engage with people that are aspiring to come to another government, they think those that they were coming to take over from were very dumb and had no ideas. And I think, well, you think they didn't have ideas, but then the system makes them have no ideas. But then this issue of subsidy, understand it properly. There are a lot of information gaps that are necessary to make a good decision. Don't delay too long. It's already there. You don't have to start doing it all over again, but put them together. You have a team who pieces everything together. Who are the poor? Who are the vulnerable? What has worked? What hasn't worked? What can we do? What are resources we have to address the problem? And then put that team together to think about it. Then after that, make a decision. Communicate that decision to the people. Communicate that decision to the people again. Communicate it to the people again. Then finally implement it easily. And then deal with the surroundings. I mean, you know what happens with every government when they come in? They get captured by those who profit from the system. In less than, the longer they stay in making decisions, the more they become captured. So very soon, the people in government who are very good at doing this, they bring up very intelligent arguments that makes them captured and remain in the same state we've been in for the past 40 years.
So essentially do it in the honeymoon period, if indeed there is any honeymoon period, but do it and get it done. Yeah.
For this
and
government,
just
there's
to
no,
say
there's no
again,
honeymoon. It's a dark moon. So because people are angry, there's anger and people are
Just to say again, Neil's book, Ending Fossil Fuel Subsidies, The Politics of Saving the Planet. There's a link in the chat room for a free copy of the book. And also to say that the policy practice did a policy brief on this issue for fossil fuel subsidy reforms. You can also pull it up in the chat room. And Henry has got a book that's coming out soon, Take Me Through. Hopefully, he will also give us some free copies on this platform. But, you know, I thank you guys so much for making time to join this conversation. And I hope that the people we're talking to are listening, or that they'll ultimately get the ideas we've shared here. But thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.